This is Love Log 3 on the 8th of January 2023. In this set of reflections, I want to think about Japan and its pattern of love and marriage. As I've explained elsewhere, this from the start was one of the central interests I had in going to Japan in 1990, because I was asked to talk about and discuss these subjects with my hosts and the universities I went to. So certainly on the first visit and throughout numerous visits, I wrote about this and thought about it. Looking back now, I can see that Japan extended my consideration of this matter a great deal after I thought I more or less had finished on the subject when I wrote my book on marriage and love in England in 1986, or published it then. Japan extended it because it is a curious test of the English thesis being that a certain pattern of social mobility and family structure and political system and other factors would lead you to the kind of romantic love, companionate marriage that you find in England for the last 1,000 years. Now, Japan was a test of this because in many ways it had the features that should contribute to companionate love marriage in a similar way. One of the surprises of working on Japan over time was that in terms of social organization, economy and politics, Japan, as people joked, was really another England. I won't document it in detail, but basically the economic system was a commercial, market, money-based system very similar to England. It was more intensive, less use of extensive and non-human power, so there were differences, but in essence it was very early market capitalist system with big cities, early financial devices, and give or take not dissimilar to medieval England onwards. So the precondition of the Western pattern, or the English pattern of marriage and love, in terms of the economy was there, that people early on went out. It wasn't based on the domestic mode of production, the fusing of the family and the unit of production. It was agricultural, but that the farms and businesses were based on market principles, on rationality, and that extended in many ways. For example, that if your eldest son was not a good manager of the estate or the business, then you would choose a younger son or adopt someone in. So market principles prevailed, and people went out and worked on the market, and there was a great deal of mobility of labour from the countryside into the cities and so on. So it wasn't a traditional farm-based peasant society of the kind that was the stereotype in anthropology of places like India and to a certain extent China. So that was a precondition. A second one was the social structure, and there two things are obvious. Firstly, it was a very fluid society where people could move up and down the social structure quite easily if they accumulated wealth, and so there were many rags to riches story about in Japan, and of people setting up firms and becoming wealthy. And so the social structure was also very reminiscent of England. There was not a fixed caste or huge dichotomy between peasants and traders and merchants and so on. They mingled together in the same way as England, and if you became wealthy, you might then buy farmland and so on. And many people did many different things over their lifetime. So the social structure in that sense was nearly identical to England over the centuries. And the other aspect of social structure, which was particularly relevant, was the family structure. The English family system from the Anglo-Saxons onwards was based on various principles. One was that you traced your family links through both your mother and your father, a bilateral or cognatic system. And this means that you can't form into a named group. You can't form into a lineage or a clan, which you can do if you trace your ancestors through just one side, male or female. And so the strong lineages and clans that you find in most traditional agrarian societies was absent in England, and you formed into networks based on yourself and tracing relations out from yourself in both directions. And so a kinship in effect was quite fragmented, quite weak, and not forming into solid groups. And likewise, it had a particular inheritance system whereby certainly in propertied families you favoured one son, primogeniture, that usually the first son, and the first male, although the other children would get something. The bulk of the estate, to keep it together, went to one heir, so male primogeniture. And the third feature, which fits in with the idea of tracing your descent on both sides, was that the kinship terminology was of a kind where you placed yourself in the centre, and then you had a ring of close relatives who you called by specific terms: mother, father, son, daughter, sister, brother. And then outside that, without taking account of whether it's through males or females, you have further rings. You have cousins, you have nephews, you have nieces, you have uncles, you have aunts, but you don't differentiate, for example, your mother's brother as an uncle from your father's brother as an uncle. You just call them uncle. Now, that system, called technically an Eskimo kinship terminology, because it's similar to the Eskimos or Inuit, is the third feature. Now, those three features, which also led in England to children never being certain of their inheritance, because another feature was that there was a very strong private property, so that the parents could, if they wanted, disinherit or pass their property or sell it or whatever by will or by sale at any point in their lives. So there was no concept of family property. When you were born, you might indeed expect to inherit, but there was no right. And so, as the medieval proverb put it, nemo est terres viventis, there is no heir to a living man, because as long as the person is living, they can send their property somewhere else. Now, those three features, which are the essence of the family system, when you go to Japan, strangely, as the work of Thomas Smith on Japanese kinship from the earliest, from over 1,000 years ago, from the Heian Nara period of the 8th, 9th century, shows that is the system that Japan has. It has it today, and it's had it, like England, back to the equivalent of the Anglo-Saxon period. So Japan has an almost identical family system. There are some variations. For example, adoption is possible and quite widespread in Japan, but it wasn't legally possible in England. Though you could absorb people into the family informally, you couldn't adopt them in until the late 19th, 20th century. So there are differences, but structurally the family system, the social structure of classes and mobility, the economic system are all very similar in the two places. And lastly, the political system of England is unusual. It's a feudal system, but it's what's known as a centralized feudal system. That is, it's unlike continental feudal systems as described by Mark Bloch, which are described as the dissolution of the state. It's not a dissolved state, it's a very powerful state. So it's based on the idea that the ruler is the center of the system at the top, but he, and occasionally she, devolves their power down to people below them, their aristocracy below them, or nobility below them, and they devolve it down to the next layer. So you have a set of devolved rights and duties. So you devolve a certain amount of power down to rich landowners who hold their land of the crown, and when they die it goes back into the crown's hands. But while they hold it, they pay certain rents and give certain support through military service or in other ways to the ruler, but they also have a lot of devolved power, and then they devolve that down to the gentry level, and the gentry devolve it down to the next level, down to the very smallest landholders in a village. So you have a 5 or 6 tier system, but pivot strongly attached to the centre. So that form of centralised feudalism is very unusual, even in the West. But curiously, it's exactly the same kind of centralised feudalism which has been documented for Japan, at least since the Kamakura period in the 12th, 13th century. So Japan also has centralised feudalism. And one result of that in relation to love and marriage is that the political and legal system, because again, the legal system based on common law and a certain kind of precedent judge-based system of the West, of England, has been found to be identical by Wigmore only in one other place, and that is in Japan. So Japan has an almost identical historical, legal and political system, and the result in both places was that the family was not the unit of political order. In most peasant agrarian civilizations, the only people you can trust who will come to your defense if another family attacks you, or you are victimized in some way or under political pressure, is the group of relatives. So in extreme forms that leads to the feud in Scotland with the clans, or vendettas or whatever in much of continental Europe and elsewhere. But there is an absence of feuding and vendettas of that kind in England, and there is a general orderliness, an acceptance that you are protected by the law and by this whole system, and therefore it is basically a safe, orderly place where the family doesn't have to give you protection. Now that system, that curious system, is the same as that in Japan. So in both places you have the basic features which lead to a great deal of mobility, individualism of a certain kind. And so you would expect that you would have a similar pattern of marriage and love if those are the causes. And yet when we talked and observed and studied in Japan the marriage and family system over a period of 15 or more years, we found that it was not like the English. It was not an arranged marriage system of the kind that we saw in Nepal. There was both a very considerable literature of love poetry and love novels and so on. So love was quite a central feature of the literary tradition and culture of Japan, and there were famously many stories of young people falling in love, not being able to marry, going off and committing joint suicide and so on. So love was widely known as a phenomenon in Japan, and yet accounts of 18th century or earlier Japan suggest that most marriages were partly arranged. That is to say, you have widespread use of marriage brokers, marriage arrangers, that families would decide that one of their children should be married, and then they would find intermediaries who would look out for a likely spouse. There was some alleged choice in the matter. If someone was chosen for your child could know who that was and see whether there was something about them that really made it very unlikely that it would work, and their feelings would be taken into account. So it wasn't absolutely arranged, and yet it wasn't a system of the kind where you go out and you leave your parents, you meet someone in another place, village, you fall in love, you have a longish courtship, and then you have a marriage. So it wasn't the English system, but it wasn't the arranged marriage system that you have in certain other parts of the world. So what was it? And this is going to be the really tricky business, because what was the other feature of Japan was that while its social structure, its economy, and its politics and law were very similar to England, its culture, that is, its religious ideology, its aesthetic and art traditions, its language, and much else, was heavily based on Chinese models. So you have a half and half situation where the way people think in terms of Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Shinto, not Tao, the way they think and their ideology, their ideas of the meaning of life and identity, the way they feel, their aesthetics, their art traditions, their craft traditions, and the way they speak, their language, is totally different from the English. So you have an intersection of two different systems, and I think that mixture accounts for the fact that the Japanese marriage and love system feels very different and strange. And this came out strongly when we talked to our closest Japanese friends, Kenichi and Toshiko, at great lengths about their marriage, and observed it and stayed with them and travelled with them. And we saw it in some of their friends who we discussed the same things. Because what was odd was that they represented their marriages as basically small businesses, small firms. Kenichi described how he chose his wife, which was that he felt it was time to set up a family, like a business. He needed to do that for various reasons, and including having children. And so he made a list of the most likely partner in this business, the women he knew, their qualities, and he ranked them in terms of various criteria, wealth, intelligence, character, beauty, and so on. And the one that came out top was Toshiko, and so he proposed to her and they got married, and she presumably did the same thing with him. It was like setting up a business and finding an appropriate partner in that business, and they ran it as partners. They stressed that it wasn't based on some deep, overwhelming love or need for companionship or anything, but it provided an efficient machine for bringing up children. And that system is very different from the English. There's some element of it, obviously, when you fall in love, and in many marriages you are making invisible calculations about those characteristics, about physical attraction, wealth, social background, education, intelligence, character. Of course, all those things are assessed and are important, but you don't do it nearly as explicitly. And once you decide that you are in love with the person, then that's how you express it. But in the case of Toshiko and Kenichi, they preserved this idea that they were strangers. They were married strangers, as I think they put it. They were people who'd come together and then decided to be together. And they remained strangers. And as such, their relationship to each other was less emotionally charged and deep than their own children. To their own children, when I asked them if there was an accident and they had to choose who to save, their children or their spouse, they said, of course, their children, because that was a blood tie and it was much closer than to their partner. So the vertical tie was more important than the lateral tie of companionship, and that is where it hugely differs from the English model. And it was found when the great Fukuzawa was translating books on English customs and family life and so on into Japanese. He came across the idea of companionate marriage, and he said, this is something that won't be acceptable in Japan, and he changed it, the wording of the books he was translating, to say that basically, of course, your parents were more important than your spouse. And that was embedded in Japanese law and tradition until recently. And part of that was a very curious feature, which is surprising me now, where in England, basically, you lived in a very individualistic, atomistic, society-based civilization for many centuries, where in general it was society, contractual, what Tönnies calls Gesellschaft, associational culture. But the one great exception to this was marriage, because there you created, through love and marriage, a Gemeinschaft, a community, where famously in the Bible and in the marriage service and elsewhere, you formed one person. You were united in blood, heart, spirit, soul. And so for the only time after leaving home and your parental relationship, you form into a little oasis of community within an associational civilization. The curious thing about Japan is that it's exactly the opposite. The way in which Kenichi and Toshiko represented it was that the family was associational, it was contractual, it was rational, it was worked out as a business deal, as it were. And that created a little pool of rationality and order within a basically hugely Gemeinschaft civilization. The rest of life was very, what the Japanese describe as sticky. That is, every kind of relationship is complicated. You are embedded with all sorts of other people. In the famous metaphor, it's a natto, that is a fermented bean curd society where everything is entangled together. And so life is extremely complicated and emotionally charged with other people all the time. But when you get home, into your home, you live in a calm, rational oasis of Gesellschaft. So it's topsy-turvy. So the last thing to say is that Japan shows that there is more to explaining the English romantic love tradition than just the social structure, the economy, and the political system. There is also the ideology. And so that takes you into the area which was very forcefully brought home to me by Kenichi, is that basically he thought that the main reason for the difference was Christianity. Now, it might be wider than Christianity, but basically the religious ideology and the culture is extremely important to understand why you have this Western tradition of romantic love, or the English one, and you don't have it in the same way in Japan, because the ideology of Christianity, which again stresses the need to break away from your parents and cleave unto your husband or wife, and that you should break away from society and follow your own desires and beliefs. That assumption is something which you don't find in the Buddhist Taoist systems, Confucian systems. So again, the influence of Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism in Japan is very important in giving the background of hierarchical family relations. So Japan is a really good test case of the various theses of causation.